Do you remember finding out that the tooth fairy isn't real? Max goes to his sister for help.
However, he is met with a surprise. Max refuses to believe his sister. He says that she chooses not to recognize the existence of the tooth fairy. Max's sister is puzzled. How can I refuse to recognize something when it's nothing? She asks.
Max's sister raises a good point. If there is nothing there in the first place, then how can she choose not to acknowledge it? However, Max spots a possible contradiction in his sister's answer. What is this nothing she is talking about? The way Ciara looks at things, she can say the tooth fairy even though it doesn't actually exist.
It's the idea of the tooth fairy that Max's sister is talking about. She says that the actual physical tooth fairy is different from the idea of the tooth fairy. Max thinks this complicates things. For example, when you say apple in a sentence, how do I know if you're talking about the apple itself or the idea of the apple?
Max's sister begins to think. Max is smarter than she thought. Max's argument is similar to a very important philosopher's view on existence, Willard Quine. If Ciara was talking about the idea of the tooth fairy, then if she were to say, "The tooth fairy has wings and flies around to give coins to children when they lose a tooth," she would be wrong. But why would Ciara be wrong, you may ask? Well, Quine's answer would be something like this. Think of the apple example again. The apple itself is red, shiny, juicy and sweet. But the idea of an apple is none of these things. An idea cannot have physical attributes because it is a mental entity. Max still wasn't satisfied that he knew what was something and what was not. Maybe Alexis Meinong can help Max. His thinking is that if you can think about something, then it has being. Kind of like by having an idea of something, you give it being. His theory of objects includes existing things, but also non-existing possible things, and even non-existing impossible things. Could it be that the tooth fairy is something, but just doesn't exist in the same way as you and I? This different type of existence can be called an unactualized possibility. It is possible that such a fairy could exist, especially because we talk about it and have ideas about it, but it's not actual, not in our world anyway. It is an interesting way of looking at the tooth fairy. Ciara may conclude that it is nothing, but Max may conclude it is something, but just doesn't have that special attribute of being actual. What do you think? Here's some examples. Water does not have the specific attribute of being dry. A square does not have the specific attribute of being round. Likewise, the tooth fairy doesn't have the specific attribute of being actual.
Max concludes that just because the tooth fairy is not something in the same way as he is, she is still something, just something different. Maybe there's a whole other world full of tooth fairies that we all talk about.
Max has touched on another philosopher's theory of possible worlds. David Lewis argues that the world we live in is just one of many. What we say exists is only what exists in this world. Thus, there are non-existent things here that do exist in another world. I think we all pretty much agree that the way things are could have turned out differently. I could have went to a different school and not met my best friend. I could have been allergic to nuts and been unable to enjoy Nutella. Where Lewis's view differs to most is when he says these alternate possibilities do in fact exist, but in another world. These things that could have been actually exist in a possible world. So, perhaps unactualized possibilities and possible worlds are a little messy and complicated, but that doesn't mean they are any less likely to exist. We don't like to rely on logic or common sense or the easy answer in philosophy. What do you think? If a thought exists in your mind, why could that thought not exist as an unactualized thing somewhere else?